and welcome to the 2020 MS Connect Conference. My name is Ben Davis. I am the Senior Vice President Mission for the MS Society of Canada, and I will be your host for today's session. Before we begin, of course, this evening's presentation, please allow me to share a few housekeeping details. Questions can be typed in the question box at any time throughout the session. Please join the online conversation and share your favorite moments from today's session by posting on Twitter using the hashtag MSConnect. Please make your voice heard and respond to our daily poll on our Twitter page at MS Society Canada. And of course, this session is being recorded and will be shared on msconnect.ca. Every year, in conference rooms across Canada, thousands of people come together to hear about the progress being made in MS research and the cutting-edge breakthroughs we are on the cusp of discovering. This year, like everything else, MS Connects looks a bit different. Instead of connecting in person, thousands of you are joining us from coast to coast on your smartphones, tablets, computers, or over the telephone line. And at a time when connection with others is so important, we are really grateful to be able to provide this opportunity for the MS community to come together in a safe and meaningful way. We know that research is the key to preventing and stopping MS, and now, more than ever, we need to ensure that this momentum continues. I look forward to hearing, along with all of you, the latest updates directly from the researchers who are on the front lines of MS research. But first, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pamela Valentine, President and CEO of the MS Society of Canada.
Hello, and welcome to the 2020 MS Connect Conference. I'm Pam Valentine, President and CEO of the MS Society of Canada, and I'm thrilled to be joining you today, albeit virtually. Many of you have taken part in the MS Connect conference before. This year, we've gone virtual, and I'm excited that for the first time, this allows us to create more connections with each other by bringing together people from coast to coast, all to one single gathering. First, I'd like to offer a sincere thank you to our amazing sponsors. Huge thanks to Roche, the leading sponsor of this inaugural virtual MS Connect. And many thanks to our contributing sponsors, Biogen Canada, Bristol Myers Squibb, EMD Serono Canada, Novartis Pharmaceuticals Canada, PendoPharm, and Sanofi Genzyme. Thanks to all our partners for their commitment in supporting MS Connect and helping to bring our MS community together this week. To create a conference like this, it takes the efforts of many within the MS community. I want to thank all those who are presenting throughout this week, providing valuable insight into the world of MS research. Thanks also to those who are hosting or sitting on panels, ready to engage in rich dialogue between members of the MS community. Globally, 2.8 million people have MS. Every 5 minutes, someone in the world is diagnosed with this unpredictable disease. And Canada has one of the highest rates of MS in the world. 12 Canadians on average each day are diagnosed. Most often, one is diagnosed in the prime of their lives, and 75% of Canadians diagnosed are women. This is the reason why I often call MS Canada's disease. The reality of MS hits close to home for so many of us. There's been so much going on in the world, all of us facing common and uncertain global issues that impact each of us. That's why it's so important that in this moment in time, we connect as a community. For each of us, community connection can sow the seeds of resilience because we know that what we face today is better faced together. It's why I'm very excited to be connecting with all of you at MS Connect. Even a pandemic won't stop us from gathering to talk about the future and what we're collaboratively doing to create a future free of MS. People, innovation, research. The theme of this year's MS Connect. It's a theme that unites the MS community. The need for connection is ever so important, especially through a time period that has challenged us to adapt to uncertain and changing circumstances. Circumstances that require us to learn, spurring the need for new knowledge generation through research. Circumstances that require us to innovate and find new ways to apply that research. Research is foundational to answering fundamental questions that will propel progress and speed us toward improved and faster methods of diagnosis, more effective treatments, and clearer pathways to cures for MS. Last year, we launched our strategy, Discover, Innovate, Act. It's a bold and ambitious strategy that sets our path forward to achieving our mission to connect and empower the MS community to create positive change. It builds upon the incredible momentum of the work done to get us where we are today, and it will move us toward our vision of a world free of MS. With our strategy, we declared 4 impact goals that we must work toward in order to achieve our vision. Advancing treatment and care, meaning diagnosing MS earlier, more accurately, and treating it more effectively. Enhancing well-being, meaning the improvement of access to social supports that impact the individual's disease trajectory and better understanding of the social determinants of health. Understanding and halting disease progression by deepening our knowledge in how to slow disease activity, prevent worsening disease manifestation, and reverse damage, no matter what form of MS you have. Ultimately, preventing MS. We know there are a host of risk factors that are modifiable. We have an opportunity to educate people about these risk factors and what can be done to minimize, reduce, or mitigate these risks. Imagine for a moment if we could stop MS before it starts so that future generations never have to worry about MS. And make no mistake, we are making progress. We have seen advancements and new insights into the mechanisms of the disease. We have better tools for diagnosis. We have an increased number of disease-modifying therapies, increasingly more effective therapies, and enhanced knowledge on how to best use existing therapies. Recent attention to different treatment strategies, examining the efficacy of escalation versus early intensive treatment. We have enhanced understanding of the different processes underlying progression and are beginning to see the development of therapies that directly target the progressive form of the disease. We are now seeing the development of a generation of promising new treatment options focused on repair, both DMTs that target repair mechanisms and stem cell therapy approaches. We have increasing understanding of the prodrome of MS, the time frame before MS symptoms develop. Indicators such as health system use patterns, biomarkers in blood and brain images that may be present years prior to the onset of disease may help us to identify early and treat proactively. Increasingly, we recognize the importance of early intervention to achieve better outcomes. Throughout this MS Connect conference, you will hear all about this tremendous work being done in MS research. This is the state of science in MS, and it's hard not to be excited by the many advances we are seeing in such a short time frame. This is truly momentum and progress. Without a doubt, the impacts of COVID on individuals in the MS community are substantial. Even without the pandemic, people affected by MS experience challenges that include barriers in accessing appropriate care, financial difficulties, and feelings of isolation. It is imperative that through and beyond these unprecedented times, we maintain the momentum of MS research. One of the positive outcomes we have seen in the face of the pandemic is the ability of our MS community at a global level to come together and understand the impacts of COVID on people living with MS. A global data sharing initiative was quickly formed earlier this year by bringing together clinician-reported data from 18 countries, including Canada, to ask and answer key questions related to COVID and MS. This initiative really stresses the need for information, resources, and support programs for people affected by MS is as urgent and critical as ever. This global initiative also exemplifies why we cannot experience a slowdown in our research momentum. Canada has one of the world's best MS research enterprises. Universities and other research institutions have seen COVID greatly impact research operations. There's no question that many research projects have been put on hold or have had to go through a process of restarting. It's important to emphasize that these challenges do not mean the entire research engine has stopped. The MS Society is firm in our commitment to continue supporting research capacity because we recognize well that if you lose that capacity, it takes a long time for it to rebuild, and the need to make sure that that momentum we've seen in MS research over the last number of years is not lost. The same can be said for our commitment to continued investment in ensuring the delivery of information, resources, and programs to people affected by MS, most especially during these difficult times. This will be no easy task. With a drastic fall in revenue, health charities like us are struggling to provide the much needed support to some of Canada's at-risk citizens. But I know together, as an MS community, we will leave no stone unturned in finding solutions and keeping the person affected by MS at the center of all we do. The resiliency I know we all have will see us through these challenging times. Although things look a little different this year, the energy and outstanding sense of community that resonates across this country serves as a reminder that although we can't be in person together we can still act. We can strive to find ways to continue to support research. We can volunteer to make a phone call to somebody who needs support through this time of isolation for many Canadians. We can go online and make a donation. We can engage in our social networks and share with our neighbors our personal MS journey to encourage and inspire those who are seeking a comforting voice. We can and will be resilient together. To all of you joining us this week for MS Connects, I hope you have an opportunity to ask questions, learn something new, share your wisdom, connect with others, quench your curiosity. Thank you for being a part of this thriving, caring community. You are the strength and resilience of an MS community that exemplifies the hope for a world free of MS.
Thank you, Pam. Your comments were wonderful, are greatly appreciated, and are a really strong call to action. And I take from your comment a couple of things that you've said. One, community connections can sow the seeds of resilience. Absolutely. Research is foundational, no question. And there's been a tremendous amount of momentum and progress over the years that has to keep moving. And opportunities like MS Connects are a great example of bringing people together to continue to power that forward. So thank you so much for your comments and your opening remarks. I would now like to introduce you to the Honorable Patty Haidu, Minister of Health, who will bring some welcoming remarks.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Patty Haidu, le ministre de Santé pour Canada, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Of course, all of you are on other traditional territories joining virtually, and I know we'd all much prefer to be in one place together, but I want to thank you for joining yet another Zoom call, yet another virtual conference, as I'm sure you're all exhausted. But it is important that we continue to work together. It is important that we continue to gather, even in this virtual way, so that we can push the work forward. I know the MS Society has worked tirelessly on behalf of people living with MS and their families to better understand and invest in research, to support families, to understand how to prevent MS. These are all the kinds of questions that I know is part of the focus of the research that you'll hear today. And on behalf of all of the Government of Canada, I want to thank the MS Society. I want to thank the researchers, the families, the doctors and the physicians, the frontline workers that are working so hard to protect people who are living with MS from the devastation of COVID-19. We know that people with underlying conditions are at more risk for very poor outcomes with COVID-19, including death, and we all have to work very diligently to protect the most vulnerable in our community, including those who are living with MS as an underlying condition. On that note, thank you so much. I hope that you learn about the wonderful research that's happening across the country, and I hope you know that I will be with you in spirit throughout the conference. I look forward to hearing the conclusion and the results of your deliberations.
That's wonderful. Thank you to the Minister for extending those terrific, welcoming opening remarks. I am now thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jack Antel, who will be presenting on building on progress in MS research, a multidiscipline effort. Dr. Jack Antel is a clinical neurologist who coordinates the multiple sclerosis research and treatment program at the Montreal Neurological Institute. His research interests include understanding the mechanisms of tissue injury and repair that account for the characteristic disease course of MS and how these can be therapeutically targeted. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Jack Antel. Jack?
Good evening, bonsoir. I would like to thank the Society for the invitation to take part in the MS Connect conference, and I want to especially thank them for the support that they've given to the research enterprise here in Canada over so many years. Tonight, what I'd like to do is present an overview of the progress that's been made in MS, but I also want to speak to you about the challenges that we still face in understanding and in treating MS. I especially want to acknowledge the contributions of the many researchers across Canada, both past and current, who've made major contributions to MS. I specifically have not excluded anybody, and I hope none of my colleagues will take offense if I don't mention them specifically by name. So in starting this evening, what I want to deal with are a number of topics with you. I want to go through with you what determines the susceptibility to MS and the disease course, and what biologic mechanisms underlie the development and the course of MS. And then we'll deal with how do we treat MS, what can we do currently, and what can we look forward to. And an important issue, as mentioned by Pam Valentine, was how can we monitor the course of MS so we can anticipate what is about to happen and we can intervene as early as possible. So I think we need to start by pointing out what is MS. And most of you will know that the way that the nervous system works and the way that we're able to function is that there is electrical conduction carries out the signals in the brain. And for the electrical conduction to occur, this has to go by the way of nerve fibers. And for this to be an efficient process, we need insulation around the nerve fibers, and that is called myelin. And if that myelin is damaged, the nerve conduction will not work, and even the underlying nerve fibers are at risk of degenerating. And so, as we think about MS, we address the issue of what about myelin injury, and we also will address, as I go through, the cell that makes the myelin, the cell called the oligodendrocyte. So please put that word in your dictionary for this evening. Now, we've known about multiple sclerosis and this damage to myelin for a very long time. The famous French neurologist Charcot presented the diagrams for us many years ago when he showed us in this picture that there were nerve fibers, if you took a case of what was MS, that had seemed to have lost their myelin, and that he also realized that people at the time had indicated that there might be some inflammation in the area where this myelin damage was occurring. And so we have tried to put these observations together as we try and understand what is this disease, multiple sclerosis. So we start with the disease MS and trying to decide or try and understand who actually gets MS and what determines the susceptibility to the disease. And we divide it into two major aspects. Is there a genetic susceptibility, or is there something in our environment? And if you look at this map of the world, which shows where the highest prevalence of the disease is, you can see that we're right in the heart of the high prevalence area. Now, why should that be? Is there something about our genes, or is there something in our environment, or is there all of this? And we point here to the pioneering efforts of the Canadian community led originally by Jock Murray and the late Don Patey, who put together networks so that large numbers of MS patients were identified and studies could be done trying to understand the susceptibility issue. And the work of George Ebers and Desi Sadovnik, that they approached this by looking at families with MS. They even looked at identical twins and showed that the rate of concordance, where both twins had the disease, was much higher than ordinary siblings. But it wasn't 100%. But this clearly marked that the genetic contribution to the disease. And over subsequent years, as molecular genetics has come, the thousands and thousands of MS patients' DNA has been examined, and there's been literally hundreds of genes where differences in this specific gene expression is a susceptibility factor for MS. And importantly, most of them have implicated genes that are linked to the body's immune system. So far, we have not identified a gene that determines the course of the disease. The genes have determined our susceptibility to the disease. And that hopefully we will, as our studies continue, we will identify what actually directs the course of the disease. And as George Ebers and Desi Sadovnik concluded, that within families, when there are multiple cases in families, this is largely driven by the genetics. But the population risk is strongly influenced by the environment. And we notice changing patterns of disease, so that the incidence of the disease it seems to be increasing in women. And that Western type of MS is now being seen more and more in Asians who've moved to the West. So that, again, we start to look at these environmental factors. And it may be of interest to you that, as far as I can tell, the very first grant from the Canadian MS Society was in 1948 to Dr. Wilder Penfield, who was the founder of the institution in which I work, and Roy Swank, a neurologist. Dr. Swank had done work in Norway, whereas this statement from his paper from 1952 says that his studies showed that there was a high incidence of MS in farming and dairy areas in Norway, and he implicated diet at that time as contributing to the disease. And since then, many large studies have been done, and factors that seem to make you more susceptible to the disease include low vitamin D, exposure to EB virus, smoking. Even a great deal of interest now is the bacteria that live in your gut and that have a great role in determining your immune status. How do they influence disease? And again, diet keeps coming up in all of these studies. Now, in this study, in this graph is plotted the course of multiple sclerosis. And all these bars show you, these are relapses of the disease. So if we plot time on this axis, typical MS starts with a relapse, so a person is aware of a neurologic problem, and then there's often a recovery, and there may be another relapse, another one, and some people, that's the entire course of the disease. In others, they gradually start to accumulate neurologic deficits, and this transformation or evolution into this progressive form is what we call secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. There are some people where it seems to be progressive right from the outset. And so we've got to understand what is causing a relapse, what underlies a recovery, and then what contributes to this progression. And on this graph, which was drawn up for us by our former colleague Amit Bar-Or, here again is the relapse and the recovery and the progression, but this time we're trying to link it to the underlying pathology or mechanisms underlying the disease. And in the blue, corresponding largely to these relapses, is this inflammation that we're going to speak about. And so this early phase linked to inflammation. As the disease progresses, this inflammation seems to be less apparent, and we've started to refer to this as a degenerative type of injury or something that's occurring right within the brain that's contributing to this process. Now, cleverly, if you look here, what Dr. Baror did is he put a little bit of red here before the blue. And that indicates, and what Pam Valentine also indicated, that the challenge is, when does this disease really start? Was this process ongoing even before the person had a relapse? And a very important issue is, are the relapses, the first inflammation going on in the brain, is that what triggers the subsequent course? And this has been emphasized at a clinical level by our colleague and friend Helen Tremlett in Vancouver, who, with Ruth Ann Mary, that have noticed that people who are subsequently diagnosed with MS have gone to the doctors more frequently than the general population, indicating that maybe something was ongoing rather early, even before the disease became apparent. So since I've mentioned that there's this relapse, recovery, and this progression, if we start to look at the brain tissues of people who are affected at different courses of disease, we can see that it looks quite different. Here is a very acute situation, or an acute relapse, and this blue area, these are outlining inflammatory cells, and a lot of these cells are cells that have come from outside of the brain into the brain. And that's a concept that we'll deal with in a few moments. As the disease evolves and becomes more progressive, that what we see is a lot of this inflammation that's coming from outside has disappeared, but there still is, what's shown in brown here, is an inflammation by a set of cells that we call myeloid cells. Some are microglia or macrophages, but these cells are persisting. They're resident cells in the brain, and we need to understand how these are contributing either to injury or to repair. And in the very late stages, we see very little of this inflammation, which means that how could a disease progress even if some of these active inflammatory cells are not there? So the challenge is to understand how the disease proceeds and how we link it to each of these mechanisms. Now, if we turn our attention to that initial lesion or the initial event, that how do we get an initial inflammatory event in the central nervous system? And we've actually known about this since the late 1800s, when the famous Louis Pasteur developed a vaccine that was effective to treat a then terrible disease called rabies. And what he did is he took the spinal cord of animals that had been infected with rabies, and he ground up the spinal cord, and he injected that into people. And it turned out that most people then made an antibody or an immune response to that vaccine, and that they were protected from the rabies. Now, unfortunately, a certain number of people who were injected with that vaccine ultimately developed an inflammatory disease of the nervous system that we've reproduced in animals, and we call this experimental encephalomyelitis. And this turned out to be that the activation of the systemic immune response led to cells going to the brain and causing inflammation. Now, very important to point out, vaccines that we now make are not made the way that Dr. Pasteur made his vaccine. There is no nervous system tissue in this, because what was eventually done is they took spinal cord or nervous system tissue that did not have the virus, and they could inject that and show that it was the brain constituent that was inducing the immune response and the disease. So again, very important, the current COVID vaccines are not made in this way. But this established the principle that if you activate the immune system outside of the brain, it can be recruited to the brain and cause inflammation in the brain. And that is what we think is happening with the acute lesions that we are associated with the relapses. And I will say a few more words on this. Now, how can we visualize that in humans? And this major breakthrough, which is now more than 30 years old, is the development of the MRI scanner. And what I want to illustrate for you is the dynamic process of lesions that come and go in multiple sclerosis. So here is a lesion that was seen on one scan, and by the next scan, shown in the green arrow up here, that lesion seems to have resolved itself. On the other hand, at the same time, there was an area here where there's no lesion, and on the second scan, a new lesion has come. So these lesions are coming and going, and that there's also lesions that some come and they don't go away, illustrating that the amount of injury that's caused can lead to an underlying more permanent deficit. So again, that MS, that's why it's called multiple sclerosis, because the lesions come at different sites and at different times. Now, this is the illustration of how this process works. So over where I'm showing you with my arrow, this is the immune system sitting outside of the nervous system, and it gets activated, and cells from this nerve and from the outside, to get in the brain, they have to cross through, get out of the blood vessels, and the blood vessels in the brain are called the blood-brain barrier. So these immune cells are attaching to the blood-brain barrier. They're getting across the barrier into the brain, and then, as we'll talk about in a minute, they're going to start damaging the cells that you put in your dictionary called the oligodendrocyte. Now, why is this particularly important? It's particularly important because once this concept was worked out, you could start making drugs that interrupted one or more of these processes. For example, you could say, here's a picture of a T cell, and I'm saying that a T cell gets into the brain. Well, what happens if we get rid of the T cells? What happens if we get rid of the B cells? Or what happens if we prevent these cells from attaching to the blood-brain barrier? And in fact, if you look through the list of medicines that we now have, this is how they're acting. We have medicines that get rid of the early B cells that prevent activation of the immune system at this level. We have drugs that prevent the T cells from getting out of the lymph nodes where they live, and they can't get across into the brain. We have medicines that stop the immune cells from attaching to the blood-brain barrier. Now, all of our currently approved medicines are acting out on the cells that are outside of the nervous system or trying to get in. We're going to start talking soon about what can we do within the central nervous system. I want to point out that much of our insight, how the trafficking occurs from outside the brain into the brain, across the blood-brain barrier, is the work of my good friends and colleagues, Catherine LaRochelle and Alex Pratt at the University de Montréal. Now, if you think that T cells and B cells were complicated enough, they actually come in many, many different varieties. This is work we did with former postdoc in our group, but you can divide T cells and B cells into many, many different subsets. And as we understand each of them, perhaps we can become more selective in our therapy so we can remove the ones that are actually contributing to the disease and leaving behind sufficient cells so there's no risk from taking the medication. Now, if we move into the brain, here's our friend, the nerve fiber with the myelin around it, the cell that makes the myelin. And now what we're starting to address is how do you actually, once these cells are in the brain, how do you start to actually damage the myelin or even the underlying nerve fiber? And the work that one can show that there are special categories of T cells that can do this damage, these myeloid cells that I mentioned before, the microglia and macrophages, and the molecules they produce. This is some of the work by Natalie Arbour, and again, Catherine LaRochelle, Craig Moore, who's now in Newfoundland, and Peter Stice, showing some of these molecules that can actually do the damage. And as you lay out these potential mediators, you start to try and identify potential therapeutic interventions. Now, in our view, a very important issue is the pathologists, when they look at the very acute early stage of MS, these oligodendrocytes, you can show that they're injured, but they're not lost. And that we think that the oligodendrocytes surviving the early injury, that can allow potentially means to protect them or stimulate them to take part in the repair process. And so I think a very good news side of this is, again, this early intervention, there's a chance of saving these cells and making them recover function. And this is illustrated, in fact, from actual work that we did together with our late colleague Sam Ludwin. And I put this in because I want to pay tribute to Dr. Samuel Ludwin, who was a stalwart of the MS research enterprise in Canada for many years and chairman of the medical advisory board and on the scientific and on the board of the MS Society. And again, the hallmark of these studies was that if you took these cells and injured them, that if you intervened early enough, these cells are capable of recovering at least some of their function. So this raises the potential for neuroprotection, an area that is just starting to evolve in multiple sclerosis. Now I want to turn to the area that if we follow, what about the relapse? And I've shown here, I illustrate for you a case of multiple sclerosis in which here, this is a lesion typical of a demyelinating inflammatory lesion. In fact, we were uncertain of the etiology, and we actually biopsied this lesion. And this is myelin, and this pale area shows you myelin is destroyed. And here's the inflammation. What is important here is when we did a follow-up scan on this individual, the lesion is gone, clearly illustrating that myelin repair can occur in the nervous system. And we've known that from animals. If you take an animal and give it a toxin, that what happens here is that the animal, this is a part of the brain called the corpus callosum, and if after the toxin, the myelin is gone, and if you take away the toxin, it comes back. And again, this occurs in the acute situation. This is an acute injury, but a recovery, and this has stimulated our search for mechanisms that allow remyelination to occur in the nervous system. Up till now, we think that most of this remyelination is done by cells that initially were early in development called progenitor cells, and they have to mature and they have to then take part in the repair. Some new data suggests that even the previous oligodendrocytes also participate. And our newer technology allows us to isolate cells from the brain. We're fortunate here at our institution. We work with surgical tissues, that these are not MS, but these are tissues that are removed as part of surgical procedures. And this has allowed us, using adult and pediatric tissues, to identify progenitor cells in the human brain. And now, as we can understand their properties, maybe we can learn more as to what makes them work more effectively. And if the cells from children, for example, are more effective than adults, then what is it that is changing over time that we can intervene with? And so the issue becomes, why is remyelination variable? Why do some lesions recover and some don't? And there are several things. One is that, as I've mentioned before, the age of the lesion. And this was work we did with our good friend from Germany, Tanya Kuhlmann. If you look at acute lesions, which are from biopsies, that the amount of remyelination is more apparent than if you look at late cases, which were done on autopsies. We also know that the extent of injury might be important, and even the site of the lesion is also important. Women tend to remyelinate better than men. And also a very important issue that's now coming up is that if experimentally, if you look at age, that the aged cells don't remyelinate as well as the young cells, and that's data that we now can see in our human studies as well. And an important issue is whether this is a reflection of the intrinsic properties of the cells, or are these cells not getting cues from their environment and that's why they're not as effective as they might be. And if they have the intrinsic capacity to myelinate, maybe what we need to look even more carefully is what is the environment like where these cells are living, and maybe we could provide the stimuli or the cues that they need for the repair to occur. Okay, now we're going to move to progressive MS, which is our real problem to have to deal with. And I'm showing you an MRI scan of a person, and this scan was done when this person could still walk, although with a limp. And this is some years later where she was dependent on a walker. And although not all of you are experts at reading MRI, you would be able to see that there are very few new lesions occurring here, so that the number of new inflammatory lesions is minimal in this person. So there must be other mechanisms of injury going on to result in this disease course. And these lesions are in the part of the brain we call the white matter. And now with more sophisticated imaging studies involving my colleague Doug Arnold and others, one can show that these lesions can actually be expanding over time. And so there are local processes that are driving the expansion of this lesion. What has now also been recognized, not only in the white matter, but if you look at the surface of the brain, you can actually see the underlying, what we call gray matter, has also lost some of its myelin and some of the nerve fiber connections. And so there's another process ongoing. And is this being driven by the surface of the brain is called the meninges, and there are inflammatory cells sitting here. And are there components of the immune system sitting here that are damaging the underlying brain? And this wonderful work done on this by our colleague and friend Jennifer Gomerman in Toronto and her team, together with the authors that you see here. So we have a new mechanism that we have to understand and perhaps can deal with. We also have to consider that the damage may be occurring not necessarily in the brain, but in the spinal cord. And this very detailed study done by Ji-Won Oh, who many of you know, who directs the program at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And that also looking in even more specialized ways that what's called myelin water imaging, pioneered by the group at the University of British Columbia. So again, you can see that the contribution by our colleagues right across the country as we're trying to understand progressive MS, where is the damage occurring and what's causing the damage. And in this little cartoon, which you can hardly read, I put in mostly to show you the relation between this surface over the brain and that could be acting on the underlying brain. That in here, which I don't think you can see, they're colored cells. This is the environment in the brain, and living in here are other cell types called astrocytes and microglia, and you're going to need to put that in your dictionary because you're going to hear a lot about these in terms of understanding the disease progress. So why is disease progressing in MS? One is that the injury continues, as I mentioned, with the immune system components. Maybe there's the failure of the repair. And the other complicated concept is that if there's been injury of cells, that over time they're under sufficient stress that they can't maintain themselves, and that there's eventually energy failure in these cells. And again, each of these can be, as we get the data supporting these, how do we intervene? Okay, and then as we go through this on the issue of the cells that I've introduced to you, the astrocytes and the microglia, shown in this picture, and I now understand that my cursor doesn't show, so I will describe it more. On what is to your left as you look at it are astrocytes in a very active MS lesion, and right beside it in this sort of yellowish is a more chronic MS plaque, and you can see that the cells do not have the same morphology. And what you can actually do either in MS, or you can do this in that model system that I showed you in the mice called EAE, And this was work done by our colleague Fran Quintana and Lior Mayo under the support of the Progressive MS Alliance. One could show that the astrocytes early in the disease seem to be contributing to the disease course, and that later on, were they good for the course, or were they trying to be protective? So early on they were, I should have said they were protective, and then maybe they're contributing. And we have to understand what are these cells producing and how can they contribute to repair. And I draw your attention to studies that have been done by Wei Yang, and in this case, a lovely paper that included his daughter on how neuroinflammation can actually contribute to the repair process. And this slide, which does not seem to be showing, but I would just needed to summarize that these cells within these glial cells that I mentioned to you, these astrocytes and the microglia, not only are they talking to each other, but they also are receiving signals from outside. And the one that I wanted to emphasize for you is, again, in the work from Fran Quintana, is that the products from the gut, actually from the gut microbiota, which we talked about, can actually get to the brain. And here you can see how the outside world can signal within the brain. And on this slide is we go to the other cell type, the microglia. And when you have myelin damage, you will not get repair unless that damage is cleaned up. And that's what microglia do. And in the work from my colleague Luke Healy, was able to show the mechanism by which microglia can phagocytose or remove the myelin. And actually, we could show that vitamin D actually can contribute to this process. Our former colleague, Veronica Miron, who is a Canadian now exiled in Scotland, was able to show how microglia can contribute to promoting repair. So the bottom line here is that these cells, these glial cells, they are dynamic cells that under some circumstances are contributing to the protecting cells or promoting repair. Under other conditions, they're contributing to injury, and we have to learn how to model this, how to understand this and manipulate this system. I just want to point out to you that it's important in terms of progressive MS. We have to make sure that there aren't mimics of MS. This is a study from my colleague Roberto Lapiana, where a person who we thought might have progressive MS actually had an underlying genetic abnormality. So what is the Progressive MS Alliance doing about this? As you know, the Canadian MS Society contributed heavily to this, and I just wanted to indicate that of the three major programs that have been going on for the last 3 or 4 years, that there are Canadians partaking in each one of these programs. Doug Arnold leading the one on looking for biomarkers, myelin repair, which I'm fortunate to have participate in, and these microglia astrocyte, how they contribute to the disease course, the work that we do together with Alex Pratt. That there's a major MS collaborative grant with Jennifer Gummerman, looking at the factors that, again, contribute to MS progression, and now this important study called CAN-PRO-CO, where they're following patients across the country with progressive MS to learn what is driving the system. Now, what about therapies? What I wanted to show in this slide is that in the early days, people did uncontrolled studies, and there was a publication from the International MS Society showing that they listed in the 1930s and 40s claims of treatment of chronic MS with an improvement rate of 40 or 50%, something that we've never matched since then. The important need for clinical trials and how we've moved from waiting till the disease manifests to early therapy of the disease. And this just shows you the number of agents that have come into use, almost all for relapsing MS, and the success that we've had. The difficulty has been that the same agents that are so effective in relapsing MS have not had the same impact in progressive MS. This is illustrated with a drug called rituximab, and that again, whether just dealing with the systemic immune system is not going to be sufficient, and how we have to deal with components within the brain itself. Is there any chance of remyelination? This is from a review article that appeared and that just lists all. You don't have to read all of the agents, but you can see the considerable number of agents that are shown to have effects on stimulating remyelination, at least in the animal model system or cells in the tissue culture, and some of these now are coming to the clinics. Now, what about stem cells? And people now can you can take fibroblasts or skin cells from anybody, and you can make them into stem cells, and the stem cells can be driven into being myelinating cells. This is illustrated by the work from my colleague Tanya Coleman. Is there any reasonable chance that we could actually transplant these cells, or is it more reasonable to think that since we have these progenitor cells living in the brain, can we stimulate them to be more effective? Now, I just want to clarify, as many of you know, you hear about stem cells in the context of people who've had bone marrow transplants, the pioneering work of Harry Atkins and Mark Friedman, and that in that sense, the treatment is to block the immune system. The stem cells are being used to replace the immune system. So I want to summarize kind of what I've said, and hope you will take this as a concept, that what we'd like to do is we'd like to really protect the brain, prevention, and so that we have no injury whatsoever. What happens if we get an acute event as shown here? And this would be my analogy to the relapse, that can we get into repair? And as I showed you, remyelination is most apparent when in the acute situation. When we get into this later stage of progression, we have many other variables. If we allow it to go on, then do we lose the cells? The environment becomes hostile. The nerve fibers become in a worse condition. And so how do we prevent from getting to this stage? And that the challenge is, are the therapies that work here, are they going to apply subsequently? So where do we go on going forward, building on our progress in MS research? And as I want to summarize how we have this multidiscipline effort. As regard as I introduced, who gets MS? We now are in the era of big data, large networks, and become even more refined in knowing what are the contributing factors. What are the mechanisms? The major breakthroughs in molecular biology are giving us new insights, and we'll start to do more in personalized medicine as we understand what are the variables that contribute to each and every person who has MS. How do you treat MS? How are we going to move from the bench to the bedside? We have to reduce the injury, and we talked about neuroprotection, promoting repair, and that's what I've really focused on with you. But I think a very important issue is how can we enhance the function of people who are currently living with MS, and you will hear much more about that during the course of the MS Connect conference about dealing with pain, fatigue, the role of exercise, plasticity. And gradually we're learning how to monitor the course of disease with brain imaging, physiologic measures, biomarkers, all of which will tell us to predict in advance what is happening and how do we intervene. And how do we work together? I'm very proud of the clinical research network we've now established in Quebec and similar going across the country. And as we work together, allowing us to take on ever more challenging problems. And with that, I want to thank you. Merci beaucoup. And we are open to questions. And I wish you a wonderful conference over the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I mean, I want you to imagine a virtual round of applause that's happening amongst our audience. Really appreciate the arc you described in terms of where we've come from, where we're going in the research community, and it certainly highlights to me, just a number of breakthroughs and just incredible areas of focus, and all the work that still is required to keep this momentum going. So thank you very much for that, and also thanks for tucking a few more words into our collective dictionaries. I appreciate it. Oligodendrocytes really rolls off the tongue, so thank you for that one. As you indicated, we do have time for questions, and as we wait for some of those questions to come in, and I remind our listeners, our viewers, that you can punch questions into the chat box as one way to do it, and so by all means, as I see them start to come in, I'll start to relay them to you, Jack. But as they're coming in, I do have a question for you. Can you comment on COVID-19 and the implications that has had on research today?
So obviously, COVID has drew a lot of our attention. And as Pam mentioned, I think early on, we needed to know immediately in terms of MS, whether people with MS were going to have a different response to COVID. Fortunately, it appears the answer is no. And even with the various therapies we have, that except for the most powerful immunosuppressants, the risk imposed by our current therapies seems to be not really measurable, and we can continue with virtually all of our therapies in the current situation. We're going to face the issue of immunization, and we're going to have to time out when people should be immunized so that we still get a response to that, but we'll be able to deal with that. So it appears that we've been fortunate that at least MS has not been markedly worsened by COVID, but I still would absolutely emphasize to people, be careful, follow the recommendations. You do not need to have COVID is not to be taken lightly.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you. And one more question for me before I go to the chat box. Are you able to, comment on, I suppose, what the implications would be, if there was a reduction in research momentum, whether it's COVID as, funding the research, but perhaps more broadly?
This is the opportunities down research are there. Research is getting increasingly expensive, and much of the research is being carried out by very bright young people, many of whom we've invested in them either through the MS Society or other major granting agencies. They're ready to flourish and bring us ideas that maybe we never even thought of, or hope we never thought of, and that to lose that generation or losing the new people coming in, that this is a major impact. It's clear that we all lost time, partly because of not being able to carry out the work, but that many of these, we shouldn't promise more than we can deliver, but the kinds of work that are being done now and the technologies that are being there, we would really want to take advantage of it. Things like in terms of imaging and watching the disease, machine learning. It's just opening up. It's a brand new area. I know that the society has invested now significantly in that just in the last very recent time. They happen to be people working near me, and for them, if they had to put that work aside, what a terrible loss that would be. And we could almost go through that one by one at various sites. So to lose the enterprise now and as Pam Valentine said, MS has been a disease where we've really made progress. The progress has showed us where the challenges remain, and now we're trying to take those on. We need the people to participate. We need to do all the various approaches. So your question and challenge to us is a very important one.
Well said. Thank you. So turning my attention to the chat box, and again, I encourage those who are watching or listening to put any question in, and we'll try and get to them all. First one is from Victoria. What is considered young cells? Could you define young cells?
So this is an excellent question, and we're really looking at it mostly in the concept of our favorite cell, the oligodendrocyte. I wish we had a simpler name for it. And that what people have shown in animal systems, and we're actually seeing this using human material, that if you take material from children, and if you take, yes, young mice versus old mice, but let's keep it in our species, youngsters are able to, the cells from the youngsters are able to repair more avidly than from the older community. And that, again, maybe that within these cell types, there are cells that are very mature, the ones that have already done their job of making myelin. We still have reserve cells called progenitors, and whether we can mobilize those as well. And there's been work done now that if what seems to be the case, if you take older cells and put them into a younger brain, they seem to, in animals, they seem to be able to have more function than if you put old cells into an old brain or young cells into an old brain. And so whether the environment is contributing, because if that's the case, it may be easier to manipulate the system than if the cells have lost their potential. So it's easier to talk young and old by children versus the, adults going on and on. Where the exact cutoff is, we don't know that yet.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. That was a good question. Next one. Is there an age where myelin reproduction would be more likely?
So that in the humans, myelin is being produced most soon, just before we're born and for the first few years after. So that's the time when myelination is the most active. And then it appears that, fortunately in humans, we don't have the model that occurs in animals. So in animals, what's been done is you give them a toxin and you can demyelinate and you can see how it remyelinates. There's not a human disease in which that occurs. So it's not so clear, we can't have the human data in that clear-cut format as to when that really occurs.
Gotcha. Thank you. Another question rolling in, and in part, it's asking you to have a crystal ball, Jack. But what can we expect in terms of years before there is a therapy that's really zeroed in on remyelination? If you could, it's kind of a frontier maybe question, but
that's an extremely good question that I don't know the answer to. That if we had this conference, if we were sitting here a generation ago, and you said to me, when are we ever going to have a therapy for any form of MS? I'm not sure we could have answered that with confidence. And a generation later, MS in its early forms has become such a treatable, almost a treatable type of disease in terms of acute lesions, and we can stop them. That obviously we are hoping very much for a breakthrough. The situation is not simple in the sense that what we're seeing is that in the acute lesion, in the acute situation, which is what all of the animal model data is about, there we see pretty robust remyelination, and I suspect we could promote that rather confidently. The difficulty is once the damage is there for a long period of time, are the same kind of principles going to hold, or are we going to have to make the myelinating cells work better? We're going to have to make the environment to be less hostile, and we have the important issue that if by the disease ongoing, the nerve fibers themselves might be damaged. And so we're going to have to deal with multiple variables, but as we've identified where the problem is, we now, even at a clinical level, can start to identify the status of the myelin cells, the status of the nerve fibers, hopefully we can start bringing it all together. But to say that it's going to be simple of remyelination and whether remyelination is the whole story, that's an oversimplification. And as I said at the beginning, we're dealing both tonight with progress and challenges, and we have to be realistic.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next question. Do we still wait for a second attack to make a diagnosis and start treating quickly? So that, I guess it's a question of first line, second line. Is the thinking shifting in the landscape from your?
So now we're into the area where we actually know a lot more about what we're doing, and that damage to the brain cannot be good. And so the early intervention, and that this is where the imaging has helped us, because in fact, most people, if they have, even with their first episode, or if a second episode when they come to attention, the MRI will actually show whether they've had multiple inflammatory events occurring. And if they've already had multiple inflammatory events, then we know it's an ongoing process and we have to intervene in the most rigorous way. And we're fortunate that the drugs we have can be given almost to everybody. So we have enough choices that we can deal virtually with everybody. So the answer is that we now have enough predictability based on very careful clinical evaluation, using clinical episodes, using MRI, that we can be quite accurate in our prediction. What is the risk of future events? And so we can intervene we should intervene much earlier.
So the notion of time is brain, right? Is
I think that's correct. That's right.
Gotcha. Thank you. There's lots of great questions coming in, so thanks everyone for your engagement on this. Next question. So what is the daily dose? So some of these are quite granular or specific, Jack, so we're putting you on the spot a bit here. But what is the daily dose of vitamin D people should take? I heard around 4,000 or 5,000 IU. Is there any dangers in that? So before you answer, I will say that the MS Society of Canada has put out some good information on our website regarding vitamin D, and I encourage our listeners to go there to get some guidance on this. But by all means.
So this is not as easy as it seems as to what are our sun exposures that drive up our vitamin D. My family's probably like many, where our grandchildren do not go out probably without major sunscreen on them, and that so that the evidence that vitamin D, yes, it's a susceptibility factor, but whether it's only vitamin D, whether it's other elements related to sunlight and UV exposure, there's evidence in that regard. That I think that the original recommendation for vitamin D was many years ago, where they tried to prevent rickets, the bone disease. And in there was some concern that vitamin D could be toxic, and so they really looked for the lowest level that could reverse or prevent bone disease. So I think we have a fair amount of leeway in increasing the levels and trying to be in some kind of range. But to think that doubling or tripling doses of vitamin D is going to reverse MS, it is a risk factor, but it's not an overwhelming risk factor. It doesn't match what we get from using our other interventions. So I think that the guidelines from the society is reasonable, but I certainly would not put people in a toxic range of vitamin D.
Thank you. Moving to stem cell therapy. So is stem cell therapy treatment approved for use in Canada? If so, what is the method of administration, cost, circumstance, when you would consider this? Thank you. So it's a long question, but a comment on stem cell where we are.
I went over this rather quickly, that we have to clarify what stem cells are we talking about. Now, if you're talking about the use of stem cells to rescue the immune system for people who've had very high intense immunosuppression, what we call the Atkins-Friedman protocol out of the University of Ottawa Hospital. They are approved actually to do that protocol on very selected patients. But remember, those stem cells are bone marrow stem cells that are rescuing the immune system. The treatment is really the immunosuppression. And that now, when Mark Friedman and Harry Atkins did their study, we certainly didn't have all the choices of therapies that we have today. So many patients who might not have been controlled in those days are now controlled by what we call more conventional therapies. So that stem cell therapy on very selected patients is available. As to my knowledge, the Ottawa Hospital has the approval. If we encounter patients here, we would rely on the expertise of that center particularly. Now, other stem cells, there's something called mesenchymal stem cells. These are cells that, again, that you can make readily. There, the idea was, would they get to the brain and would they be protective in some way? Those clinical studies, which were Canadians with Mark Friedman again and Ruth Ann Mary and the group in Winnipeg playing a central role, that has been looked at, and the results are not entirely clear yet as to whether that's playing a major role. Those are going to be complicated to think about as therapies because it's so complicated to make the cells. Now, the final one, which is really experimental and is not in clinical use anywhere, is, as I mentioned, is to actually make stem cells that are myelin producing cells. And if you injected those into a person, are they clever enough to get to the brain, find the site of injury? This is still at very much an experimental stage, and this is not being used. The clinical trial that's going on that I'm aware of is with my colleague Gianvito Martino in Italy, where they've injected these kinds of neural stem cells into the spinal fluid, and they're looking to see whether they actually get to the brain or not. So we're far away from using stem cells as a therapy for MS. And again, please keep straight between, are you trying to replace a brain cell versus are you trying to replace an immune cell that's part of an immunosuppressive protocol?
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Another question. How is demyelination recognized? Is it only visible on autopsy, or are there other ways of seeing this? So, broader question
Very good.
around.
Very good and important question, because when we look at conventional MRI and you see the lesions that I showed you on several of the slides, that is not necessary. There is demyelination in that area, but it's also inflammation and fluid accumulation, so it's not very specific. There are emerging MRI techniques. I briefly mentioned the group at UBC where they measure what's called myelin water fraction. There are other measures that can be done. So there are very more specialized MRI techniques that can also measure more specifically myelin, because if we're talking about increasing myelin, we need to be able to monitor it more specifically. The other, which has not received as much attention, is, as I mentioned right from the outset, for a nerve fiber to conduct its electrically, it needs its myelin. And there are ways called physiologic ways. There's things called evoked responses that, for instance, can be done to see how your visual stimuli are conducted. And we can use those techniques to see whether the myelin is in place or not, because if it's not in place, the conduction rate is lower. And this may be a very useful way of, if you introduce a medication that might increase remyelination, maybe we can measure it by what's called evoked responses. And that was used in the study that came from San Francisco with a drug called clemestine, which is a very valuable approach. So both imaging and by physiology, we may be able to actually see myelin. What's that? We can't hear you. Now we're back.
Just talking slowly to make sure that there's no questions being put in. I think, Jack, we will probably call it a night. So I first want to, again, extend my absolute appreciation to you for your contribution tonight. I'm always struck by, whenever I partake in a research conversation and a research presentation, the contributions that are made by Canada. And your leadership is a big part of that, Jack. So thank you very, very much.
Well, I want to thank you. Let me just emphasize how important I think the MS research mission has been and how important the society has been to sustaining that mission and pulling the community together. It's been, and the people affected by MS have played a major role in taking part in these kind of studies. And I think we go forward together as a team.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. And I'm making a note that it looks like we've lost some audio for our English listeners. So our apologies for that. But Jack, we're just going to continue with the wrap up here, I think, at this point.
Merci and bonsoir à tous.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it's unfortunate that we've lost the sound in our for our English listeners. My deepest apologies. But given the time, unless I hear otherwise, I'm going to continue to wrap this up. So in particular for our French listeners. So I would first want to take this opportunity once again to thank our sponsors for providing the support to make this conference possible. Please don't forget to visit our vendor fair at msconnect.ca/vendor fair, where you can learn more about available products, services, and check out our msconnect.ca/research posters, which there are many, to learn about the work of up-and-coming MS researchers. It's a really fantastic platform, and we hope that all of you take the time to engage in all of its opportunities. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to thank each and every one of you for investing your time and learning more about MS and MS research. All research sessions are being recorded and will be available for viewing at a later date at msconnect.ca. I look forward to seeing all of you at tomorrow's session with Drs. Michelle Plowman and Wei Yang on neuroplasticity and neurorehabilitation. So again, thank you so much for your time. Merci beaucoup. Be safe out there. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.